What if I told you that there was once a king, so physically debilitated, so obviously cursed, that even his most loyal subjects believed he was the son of the devil? His name was Charles II of Spain, the last of the mighty Habsburg dynasty. But to those who saw him, he was not a king, he was an omen. They did not call him a monarch, an emperor, or a ruler. They called him El Hechizot, the Enchanted One. But this was not some medieval ghost story whispered in the dark. It was real, truly terrifying. His court, his clergy, his subjects, no one could explain how a man born of royal blood could look so disfigured, speak so incomprehensibly, and suffer so endlessly. Whispers spread like wildfire through the marble halls of El Escorial. He is cursed. No man of flesh and blood could ever look like him. Yet the curse was not the work of witchcraft. The truth was much darker, for it came not from the devil, but from within the family itself. The most powerful dynasty in Europe was not invaded or overthrown. No, it was rotten from within. Generation after generation, the Habsburgs chose blood over biology. They married cousins, uncles, nieces, tightening their grip on the throne while slowly unraveling the genetic thread of their own survival. Charles was no accident. He was the logical conclusion of the family's unbridled arrogance. What makes this story even more chilling is how it ends. Not with assassination or a revolution, but with a slow, terrible deterioration of mind and body so profound that even his autopsy reads like a horror novel. When Charles II finally died at the age of 38, doctors discovered a man as internally corrupted as his rule, his heart shriveled, his brain drowned, his organs rotting in silence. This is not just the story of a cursed king. This is the autopsy of power itself, of what happens when human ambition defies nature. If you think you know your royal history, think again, because the story of Charles II is not a footnote, it is a warning. And we are only just beginning. They say a king's voice should command nations, but Charles II could barely command his own mouth. The first thing foreign ambassadors noticed wasn't his crown or his throne, it was his face. His jaw jutted forward grotesquely, his lips could not meet, his mouth hung perpetually open like a door broken from its hinges. This was no minor defect, it was a symbol of centuries of royal obsession gone catastrophically wrong. This deformity had a name, mandibular prognathism, but history remembers it more infamously as the Habsburg jaw. For over 200 years, the House of Habsburg had practiced one unbreakable rule: keep the bloodline pure. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, and with every generation their once mighty DNA collapsed in on itself like a crumbling empire. Charles was not just born into this legacy, he embodied its final failure. His teeth did not align, his upper row sat far behind his lower, rendering chewing almost impossible. Meals became ritual humiliation. Food had to be mashed, pureed, liquefied, fit for a sick child, not a sovereign. Even then, soups dribbled from the corners of his lips, solids fell out mid-bite. Servants hovered beside him, cloths in hand, wiping spittle from his chin as if they were nursing a dying man. Worse still was his speech. The same twisted jaw that made eating a spectacle turned royal decrees into garbled, slurred mumbles. Diplomats couldn't understand him, not because of language barriers, but because his words spilled from a mouth that refused to cooperate. His proclamations required interpreters, not for French or Latin, but for Spanish. Behind palace walls, even his own mother, Queen Mariana, confessed in a letter her terror that Charles might choke on his tongue in his sleep. The King of Spain, heir to an empire that stretched across continents, was quite literally a choking hazard. And the true horror? The Habsburgs knew. They had watched their heirs grow weaker, sicker, more deformed with every generation. And yet, they persisted. Power mattered more than pain. Prestige mattered more than people. Charles's face wasn't a tragedy, it was a warning, carved into bone. If Charles II's jaw was a warning sign, then the rest of his body was a full-blown catastrophe. At 35, he didn't look like a king in his prime, he looked like a child mangled by some cruel hand of fate, a puppet held together by bones too fragile to bear the weight of a crown. He stood just over 5 feet tall, his limbs were so thin they resembled twigs, while his torso seemed compressed, hunched, almost warped. His head? Enormously disproportionate, bobbing atop a neck too weak to support it. He couldn't walk until the age of 8, think about that. While other children were learning to ride horses or hold swords, Charles was learning how to stand without collapsing. Even once he managed to walk, he shuffled rather than strode, staggering from wall to wall like an old man decades from death. Palace servants described him as lurching through the corridors, gripping furniture for balance. A king in name only, dragged forward by the weight of a broken lineage. And then came the mental toll. Charles's mind, like his body, lagged far behind. He didn't learn to read until he was 10, barely. He couldn't concentrate, he couldn't retain. Tutors wrote of trying to pour knowledge into a vessel already cracked, leaking every lesson into the void. Emotionally, he was a boy trapped in a man's body, prone to fits of screaming, violent tantrums over trivial slights. One moment he would rage like a storm, the next sit in eerie silence, unblinking, unreachable. Even his appearance betrayed him. His hair grew in sparse, lifeless patches. It fell out in clumps, leaving behind a scalp mottled and raw. Court painters, tasked with immortalizing the royal majesty, struggled to disguise the reality. They softened angles, added color, shaded deformities into shadows, but the truth couldn't be fully hidden. Charles didn't look like a king, he looked like a cautionary tale. Most horrifying of all, he was deteriorating. His body wasn't stabilizing with age, it was unraveling. As the years passed, his strength failed faster than time should allow. He wasn't aging, he was disintegrating, cell by cell, under the unbearable weight of his bloodline's ambition. A king's greatest duty is to produce an heir. For Charles II, even that most basic royal function proved impossible. Twice he was married. Twice he failed. Not just politically, but biologically. The tragedy wasn't just personal, it was continental. The fate of Europe teetered on the fragile shoulders of a man who could not procreate. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orléans, arrived in Spain full of youth, beauty, and high expectations. She imagined herself marrying a powerful monarch. Instead, she met a man with the intellect of a child and the body of a withered husk. The wedding night became the talk of the court, not for romance but for horror. Servants whispered that Marie-Louise emerged pale, trembling, in tears. Charles, meanwhile, looked bewildered, confused by what had just transpired. Behind closed doors, doctors made a damning discovery. Charles's reproductive organs were so underdeveloped, so infantile in structure, that functional intercourse was impossible. He had, quite literally, the body of a boy masquerading in a king's robes. But in a court built on appearances, truth was unacceptable, so they blamed her. Marie-Louise, once vibrant and intelligent, became the sacrificial lamb. Physicians examined her endlessly, priests ordered her to drink simuli fertility concoctions. Nobles gossiped about her failure while never acknowledging the elephant in the throne room. The mental toll crushed her. She withdrew from society, sank into depression, and prayed endlessly for a miracle that would never come. When she died at just 26, some whispered from poison, others from grief. The Spanish court barely paused before replacing her. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, arrived not in hope but desperation. The court needed an heir, any heir. But nothing changed. In private letters, Maria Anna confided her horror. Charles's condition had worsened. She described her husband's touch as cold, his body as lifeless, his presence as spectral. Every doctor, every apothecary, every charlatan in Europe was summoned. None could change nature's decree. Outside the palace, vultures circled. France, Austria, England, all watched as Spain's king withered, childless and dying. They didn't see a man. They saw a throne without an heir. War loomed like a shadow behind every royal curtain, just waiting for the inevitable. And the irony? The dynasty that had obsessively hoarded power through inbreeding had finally bred itself into extinction. When science failed to explain Charles II's unraveling body, the Spanish court turned elsewhere, to something older, darker, and far more terrifying. If doctors couldn't heal him, perhaps priests could. Thus began one of the most bizarre chapters in European royal history: public exorcisms, performed not in secrecy, but in the gilded heart of the royal palace. They didn't call them treatments, they called them battles. Battles against the devil himself. Father Froilan Diaz, the court's chief exorcist, declared that Charles was inhabited by not one, but 47 demons, each responsible for a different aspect of his affliction. His twisted jaw, a demon of pride. His shriveled body, a demon of lust. His infertility, a demon of envy. It wasn't medicine Charles needed, it was purification. And so, the throne room became a battleground of heaven and hell. Before stunned nobles and foreign dignitaries, the King of Spain writhed on the marble floor as priests screamed Latin incantations, flung holy water, and pressed crucifixes against his pale, shaking flesh. At times, Charles would vomit violently. At others, he collapsed in spasms, his body so frail it could barely endure the spectacle. Still, the priests shouted that the demons were resisting, that their suffering was proof the ceremony was working. It got worse. Father Diaz ordered Charles to drink holy water laced with powdered relics, fragments of saints' bones ground into a foul slurry. When the king gagged and retched, they rejoiced. The devil is fighting to stay. Charles, mentally fragile and emotionally broken, began to believe them. He begged for more exorcisms, more rituals, more pain, for the promise of peace, no matter how false. Soon it wasn't just the king, it was the entire palace. Servants were forced to burn clothing, furniture, even royal heirlooms believed to be tainted. Bonfires roared in palace courtyards as sacred chants echoed against marble walls. It was less a court of empire than a madhouse cloaked in incense and fear. The king wasn't being healed, he was being tortured by a system too terrified to accept the truth. His body was failing, not because of demons, but because of his dynasty's sins. And still, the whispers grew. What kind of king needs 47 demons exorcised just to survive another day? When Charles II finally died in 1700, at the age of 38, Spain did not just lose a king, it confronted a nightmare. For decades, the royal court had whispered that Charles was cursed, bewitched, a vassal of demons. But now his lifeless body would be opened, examined, exposed. And what the royal physicians found inside would horrify Europe for generations. The autopsy was conducted in secret, behind locked palace doors, away from the eyes of the public and the foreign ambassadors already sharpening their political knives. But secrecy couldn't contain the truth. The findings were so grotesque, so beyond the boundaries of nature, that the official report was almost immediately suppressed. Yet the details leaked anyway. Charles's heart, according to Dr. Geronimo de la Fuente Pierola, was no larger than a walnut, blackened, shriveled, incapable of sustaining life. His lungs were described as gangrenous, soaked in fluid and rotting from the inside. The stench, so overpowering, forced several assistants to flee the room mid-procedure. His intestines, putrefied. His reproductive organs, the source of so much political chaos, were found to be catastrophically underdeveloped, affirming what doctors had long suspected but never dared to confirm. And then came the final horror. When they opened his skull, they discovered his brain was swimming in fluid, what we now call hydrocephalus. The brain tissue itself was discolored, damaged, and soft. His mental delays, his outbursts, his childlike reasoning suddenly made cruel sense. His mind had been deteriorating from within for years, possibly since birth. Dr. Pierola concluded his report with a sentence that shook European courts to their foundations. "It is a miracle. This body sustained life for so long, as it contained not a single healthy organ." Rather than dispel the supernatural rumors, the autopsy confirmed them in the minds of many. How could any man live in such a state, unless some dark force had kept him alive? But the truth was far more damning than witchcraft. Charles wasn't cursed by demons. He was engineered by centuries of royal incest, political vanity, and willful ignorance. And so the last king of the Spanish Habsburgs died as he had lived, not as a ruler, but as a warning carved in flesh. Charles II didn't die with a sword in his hand or glory on his lips. He died alone, childless, and disintegrating. His body a battlefield, his bloodline a graveyard. With his final breath, the once mighty House of Habsburg collapsed like a rotting cathedral, its proud legacy reduced to the image of a man too broken to speak, too sick to walk, too cursed to continue. And what followed was nothing short of chaos. Within months of his death, Europe erupted into the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal, decade-long conflict fought not over ideas, not over justice, but over an empty throne. Hundreds of thousands would die. Kingdoms would rise and fall. The borders of Europe would be rewritten, all because the Habsburgs had clung to power so tightly they strangled their own future. This wasn't fate. This was hubris. Charles was not a mistake. He was the inevitable result of generations that valued bloodlines over biology, titles over truth, legacy over life. His story is not just a historical oddity, it's a dark parable about what happens when absolute power consumes itself. The tragedy of Charles II is not that he was bewitched, but that he was engineered to fail. Piece by piece, gene by gene, decision by decision. Every twisted bone, every drooling syllable, every failed attempt at conception was the echo of royal arrogance whispering, "Keep it in the family." And in the end, it did. What remains now is not just a body in a tomb, but a legacy, preserved in autopsy reports, court records, and the trembling brushstrokes of court painters who tried, in vain, to hide the truth. No portrait could erase the curse. No crown could cover the cost. So the next time you hear tales of royal splendor, of golden blood and divine right, remember Charles II. Remember, the king who could not rule, could not love, could not leave an heir. Remember that sometimes the greatest threat to a throne isn't rebellion, it's inheritance. If you found this story haunting, gripping, or unlike anything you've learned in school, hit that like button, subscribe to Whispering Myths, and tell us in the comments what other royal secrets are waiting to be unearthed. Because this was just the beginning.